The prison stood like a dark scar against the mountains, its stone walls rising high above the trees and cliffs. It was a place built not only to hold men, but to break them, to grind away their hope until nothing remained but silence. The guards believed it was unbreakable, a fortress no man could escape from, because on one side, the cliffs dropped straight into jagged rocks, and on the other, a forest stretched so deep and twisted that no one dared to enter. Inside the prison, time did not pass, it dragged. Every day felt the same, the sound of iron doors slamming, the rattling of keys, the heavy boots of guards echoing in the halls. The prisoners moved like shadows, each one carrying his own story, his own weight of crimes real or imagined. Among them was Daniel Hale, a man who had been locked away for nearly 10 years, accused of theft and murder, crimes he swore he never committed. Daniel was not the strongest, not the loudest, but he had something many others had lost. He had patience and the will to watch and wait. Every morning he woke before the guards marched through. Every night he lay still, listening to the faintest noises in the prison, the click of a lock, the footsteps of a guard, the heavy boots of guards echoing in the halls. The prisoners moved like shadows, each one carrying his own story, his own weight of crimes real or imagined. Among them was Daniel Hale, a man who had been locked away for nearly 10 years, accused of theft and murder, crimes he swore he never committed. Daniel was not the strongest, not the loudest, but he had something many others had lost. He had patience and the will to watch and wait. Every morning he woke before the guards.
The prison yard was a place of tension, where men pretended to stretch their limbs and enjoy the pale sun, but in truth it was a place of deals, of threats, and of silent warnings. Guards stood at the edges, their rifles slung over their shoulders, while the prisoners circled the yard like restless animals. Daniel walked among them, his eyes lowered, his steps measured. He had been watching one man for weeks, the one they all called Briggs. Briggs was taller than most, his shoulders broad, his jaw lined with scars, his eyes sharp and cold like broken glass. He had a reputation that reached every corner of the prison. Men avoided his stare and gave him space in the food line, because Briggs was known to end fights before they began, with fists like iron. But Daniel saw more than a brute. He saw a man who had influence, someone who could silence doubters, someone who could stand against guards if needed, someone who could help carry out the impossible. On a gray morning when clouds smothered the sky, Daniel approached him. Briggs stood with his back to the wall, arms crossed, watching the yard as if nothing could touch him. Daniel slowed his pace, careful not to draw attention, then stopped a few steps away and said, quietly, "I have been watching the guards." Briggs shifted his gaze, a slow turn, his eyes falling on Daniel with a weight that nearly stopped his breath. "And why would that matter to me?" he asked, his voice low like distant thunder. "Because," Daniel said, "because they are not as careful as they think they are, and because I know a way out." For a moment silence stretched. Only the sound of boots crunching gravel filled the yard. Then Briggs laughed, a harsh sound that made two men nearby flinch. He pushed off the wall and stepped closer, until Daniel could see the scars on his knuckles and the faint line of an old burn on his neck. "You think you know a way out?" he said. "No one gets out of here, not alive, not even the rats escape." Daniel met his gaze, steady and calm. "I do not think, I know. I have been planning for years." The words hung between them, and for the first time Briggs did not laugh. His eyes narrowed, sharp with interest. "Go on," he said, "but if you are wasting my time, you will not live to regret it." So Daniel leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper, and told Briggs about the rusted fence behind the far tower, the gap hidden in weeds, the storms that drowned every sound, the way the guards grew lazy when thunder shook the sky. Briggs listened, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. Then slowly a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You are either a genius or a dead man walking," he said. Daniel answered calmly, "Maybe both." Briggs chuckled, a sound rare and unsettling, then nodded once. "If this works, Hale, you will need more than courage. You will need strength and luck, and you will need me." That was the moment the alliance was born, the most unlikely pair in the prison, a quiet thinker and a feared fighter. Their fates now bound together by the wildest plan that place had ever known.
The nights in the prison were heavy with silence, broken only by the clanging of distant doors and the calls of guards making their rounds. For most prisoners, night was a time to sink into uneasy sleep, but for Daniel and Briggs it became the heartbeat of their secret. Daniel had shown Briggs the loose brick beneath his bunk, the hiding place for the notebook, its pages lined with sketches and notes written so small they looked like scratches of a desperate man. Briggs flipped through it with calloused fingers, his brow furrowed as he studied the careful records of shifts and patrols. "This is not a dream," Briggs muttered. "This is a map." Daniel nodded, his voice low. "It is a chance." The first tests were small acts, hidden in the noise of prison life. Briggs created distractions, fights in the yard, arguments in the line for food, even a sudden shout during night roll call. While guards rushed to silence chaos, Daniel counted their movements, noted which ones responded slowest, which towers were left momentarily blind, which corners grew weakest under confusion. The next test came in the workshop, a place where prisoners labored under the eyes of armed guards, hammering metal, welding broken tools, sharpening blades. Daniel eyed the scraps of metal left behind, thin pieces, sharp enough to cut through rust, but small enough to be hidden in a sleeve. Briggs created another diversion, a sudden shove that sent two men into a pile of chains, the sound crashing through the workshop like thunder. In the chaos, Daniel slid a shard of metal into his boot, his heart pounding but his face calm as he bent to lift a fallen tool. That night, in the silence of the cell, Briggs watched as Daniel scraped the metal against a pipe, the faint grinding sound hidden beneath the rain hammering on the roof. Slowly they tested the rust on the fence near the far tower, working bit by bit when no eyes were watching, pulling weeds to cover their work, each time careful not to leave a mark that could betray them. The storms were their allies, the thunder covering the noise, the downpour hiding the scent of wet iron, the lightning flashing across the forest like a warning and a blessing. For weeks they worked, carving small paths through weakness and silence, each night bringing them closer to the moment when planning would become action. But word in the prison spread like smoke. Nothing stayed hidden for long. Men watched with suspicion. Whispers crawled through the cell blocks, and Daniel knew their secret teetered on the edge of discovery. One evening, as the rain began again, Briggs leaned against the wall of the cell, his voice low and sharp. "Someone is watching us, Hale." Daniel paused, his hand frozen over the notebook. "Who?" Briggs narrowed his eyes toward the far end of the block.
a man who kept to himself, a man who rarely spoke but always listened. His name was Carter.
Carter had always been a quiet figure in the prison. He ate alone, he spoke rarely, and when he did, his words were clipped and sharp, like broken glass. He was not the strongest, not the loudest, not the kind of man who ruled the yard, but he had a way of knowing things, a way of listening without being noticed, a way of seeing what others missed. Daniel had seen him before in passing, a thin man with sharp eyes and restless hands, a man who did not belong to any group, yet never seemed weak enough to be prey. Now, those same sharp eyes lingered too long when Daniel and Briggs moved through the yard, when they worked in the workshop, when they walked the line at roll call. Briggs was the first to notice, and he did not hide his suspicion. "He is watching us," Briggs muttered one night as they sat in the cell, shadows stretching long across the walls. "He knows something." Daniel knew it too. But where Briggs saw danger, Daniel saw possibility. If Carter knew, then silence could only be bought two ways, by trust or by force. The next morning, Daniel made his move. During yard time, he walked past Carter as if by chance, dropping a folded scrap of paper into his hand without slowing his pace. "Meet by the laundry room tonight," it read. When the hour came, Carter was waiting, his back against the wall, his expression unreadable as Daniel approached. Briggs stood behind him, arms crossed like a wall of stone, his eyes narrowed, his patience thin. Carter spoke first, his voice low. "You two are planning something." Briggs stepped forward, his fists tightening, his tone dangerous. "And what if we are?" Carter did not flinch, his gaze steady. "Then you will need me." The words surprised Daniel, though he kept his face calm. "Why would we need you?" "Because," Carter said, "because the guards do not look twice at me. They think I am no threat. I hear things. I see things. I know which men will sell secrets and which ones will keep quiet, and I know which guards drink before their shift and which ones fall asleep in the tower." Briggs let out a harsh laugh. "And why would you risk your neck for us?" Carter's eyes darkened, his jaw tight. "Because I cannot die in here. I will not rot behind these walls. I need out as much as you do." For a long moment, silence filled the room, the hum of machines in the laundry drowning their thoughts. Briggs turned to Daniel, his voice sharp. "I do not trust him." Daniel studied Carter, searching his face for lies, but all he saw was desperation, the same kind that lived inside his own chest. He met Briggs's stare and said, "We cannot do this alone." Briggs grunted, his jaw clenched, but he stepped back, giving a reluctant nod. So it was decided. 3 men bound together by a single plan, 3 men who could not turn back. But Daniel knew the truth. The more men involved, the greater the risk, the closer the fire burned to being exposed. And, somewhere deep inside the prison, someone was already listening, someone who would not stay silent forever.
The sky turned black long before night fell, clouds rolling heavy over the mountains like a tide of shadows. By evening, the first drops of rain tapped against the stone walls, and the wind howled through the narrow gaps of the prison windows, carrying with it the smell of lightning. Daniel sat on his bunk, his heart beating slower than his thoughts.
his notebook hidden away for the last time. He did not need it now. Every detail was etched into his memory. Briggs paced the cell like a caged beast, his muscles tense, his fists clenching and unclenching as if ready to fight the storm itself. Carter sat silent in the corner, his hands clasped together, his face pale but his eyes sharp. The quietest of the three, but perhaps the most restless. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied again, the storm pressing down on the prison like a hand of iron. When the guards moved through for roll call, their voices were strained against the thunder, their eyes heavy with fatigue. Daniel knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. When the cell doors locked and the footsteps faded into the distance, Briggs leaned close, his voice barely a growl. "It is tonight, Hale. No turning back." Daniel nodded, his throat dry, then whispered, "It is tonight." They waited until the thunder roared above them, until the rain fell so hard it drowned the sound of boots and keys, until even the guards leaned into their coats and cursed the weather. Then Briggs forced the loose brick free and pulled out the shard of metal Daniel had hidden, the edge dull but strong enough for rust. They slipped into the corridor, moving with the rhythm of silence, shadows among shadows, each step measured, each breath timed with the storm. Carter led the way past the workshop, his memory of guard patterns proving true. The tower to the east stood dark, its watchers slumped in careless sleep. At the far corner, the weeds swayed wild in the rain, their leaves thrashing against the rusted fence that had been waiting for this night. Briggs knelt first, jamming the shard of metal into the corroded bars, scraping, twisting, pulling, until the iron gave way with a groan, masked by thunder. Daniel pressed against the fence, forcing the gap wider, while Carter crouched low, his eyes darting to the tower, his body shaking with every flash of lightning. One by one they slipped through, Briggs first, his frame straining against the jagged edges, then Daniel, pulling his coat close to avoid the tearing metal, and finally Carter, scraping his shoulder as he forced himself into the mud beyond. The forest loomed before them, dark and endless, the trees bending under the storm, their branches snapping like bones. Behind them, the prison glowed faintly against the rain, its towers blurred, its walls fading into shadow. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the air of freedom against his face, raw and sharp, carrying the scent of earth and storm. But as he turned to follow Briggs into the trees, he froze. Footsteps echoed behind them, faint but unmistakable. Daniel froze, his breath held tight in his chest, the sound of footsteps rising above the storm for a moment, before sinking again into the rain. Briggs turned his head, his fists already clenched, his eyes fierce and ready for a fight. Carter crouched low, his body trembling with tension, his gaze locked on the fence, expecting a guard to appear with a rifle raised. But no guard came. Instead, a flicker of light shimmered faintly between the trees to their right, not the harsh white of searchlights, but a softer glow, the wavering flame of a lantern. The three men stared in silence, rain dripping from their hair and clothes, the storm roaring above them. The light grew closer, swinging slowly in the dark, until the outline of a figure emerged from the forest. It was an old man, wrapped in a heavy coat, his hat wide and dripping water, his hands steady as he held the lantern high. He stopped a few steps away from them, his eyes shadowed under the brim of his hat, his voice rough but calm. "You should not be here. Not tonight."
Briggs stepped forward, his voice sharp and threatening. "Then point us to the road, old man, and we will be gone from your sight." The stranger did not flinch. Instead, he lifted the lantern higher, letting its glow spread across their faces, his gaze lingering on Daniel as if he recognized something in him. "The road is near," he said, "but the forest is not safe. The storm hides more than thunder. There are things here worse than prison guards." Carter shifted nervously, his eyes darting to the shadows between the trees, as if he expected something to move there. Briggs scoffed and spat into the mud. "We do not need your ghost stories. We need the way out." But Daniel held up a hand, stopping him. There was something in the old man's tone, something that felt heavier than simple warning. Daniel stepped forward, rain dripping into his eyes, and asked, "What do you mean, worse than guards?" The old man's lantern flickered as the wind pushed against the flame, yet his grip never shook, his voice low and steady. "Men vanish in these woods, not from bullets, not from chains. They vanish as if the earth itself swallows them whole." The storm groaned above them, thunder rolling like drums, and for a moment none of them spoke. Then the old man turned his back to them, the lantern swaying as he said, "Follow me if you wish to see the road, but do not stray from my light." Without another word he began to walk deeper into the trees. Briggs muttered a curse but followed, his heavy boots sinking into the soaked ground. Daniel stayed close behind, his heart pounding with unease. And Carter trailed last, his eyes fixed on the swinging glow ahead. The forest closed around them, branches twisted and bent as if leaning down to watch them. The rain muffled into a strange silence, each step echoing louder than it should have. Daniel kept his eyes on the light, afraid to look too far into the shadows, afraid of what might be waiting there. And as they walked deeper into the woods, he began to wonder if freedom had only led them into another kind of prison. The rain eased, but the forest did not grow kinder. The branches hung low, their dripping leaves brushing against the faces of the three men as they followed the lantern's glow. The old man did not look back, his pace steady, his boots finding ground where theirs slipped in the mud, as if he knew every root and stone of the path. The flame of his lantern swung in a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic, pulling them deeper into the night. Briggs muttered under his breath, his voice sharp with suspicion. "This old fool is leading us in circles." Daniel hushed him, his eyes fixed on the glow ahead. "We have no choice," he whispered, "unless you want to stumble blind into the storm." Carter said nothing, his lips pale, his eyes darting into the darkness with every gust of wind. Then the trees parted. The storm had pushed a bank of clouds low across the sky, leaving the world darker than ink. But the lantern light revealed shapes hidden in the woods, broken stones half buried in the mud, arches crumbled to rubble, walls collapsed and overgrown with roots. The ruins stretched before them like the skeleton of a forgotten city. The old man stopped at the edge and raised the lantern high, the light spilling across the moss-covered stone. "This place was here before the prison, before the forest, even before men like you were thought of," he said. His voice was calm, but there was weight in his words, as though he carried knowledge no sane man should carry. Briggs spat into the ground. "Ancient rocks won't keep me warm, won't hide me from dogs and bullets," he growled. "We should move on." But Daniel stepped forward, his eyes caught by the carvings etched faintly into the stone faces, shapes twisted into symbols that felt alive under the flicker of the flame. He reached out, his fingers brushing the damp surface,
The lines cut deep into the stone. They felt colder than the rain, colder than the night itself. Carter finally spoke, his voice trembling. "I do not like this place. The air is wrong, too heavy, too still," he whispered, his eyes wide, as if shadows shifted just beyond the edge of the lantern's reach. The old man looked at Daniel, the firelight catching in his eyes. "You hear it, do you not?" Daniel frowned, his hand still pressed to the carvings. "Hear what?" he asked. "The silence," the old man answered. And he lowered the lantern slowly, revealing a dark stairway leading down into the earth, hidden beneath a collapsed arch. The storm rolled above them, thunder shaking the sky and lightning flaring through the trees. Yet down here the shadows seemed thicker, untouched by the flashes. Briggs let out a sharp laugh and clapped Daniel on the back. "You are not going down there, are you?" He sneered at the stairway as if it mocked him. But Daniel did not answer, his eyes locked on the darkness below, drawn by something he could not explain. The old man held the lantern closer to Daniel, the firelight flickering in the wind. "You sought freedom," he said softly. "Perhaps what lies below is the only way you will find it." Daniel swallowed hard, torn between fear and an unshakable pull dragging him toward the stairway. Behind him, Briggs cursed again, but his fists clenched as if even he felt the weight of the place. Carter trembled, his breath shallow, whispering prayers under his breath as the shadows seemed to move like water. The night grew heavier, the ruins groaning under the storm as though the earth itself was urging them downward. And Daniel knew the choice before him was no longer just about escape. It was about what waited in the dark.
Daniel stood at the mouth of the stairway, his breath caught in his throat. The storm above rumbled like a warning, yet the darkness below seemed to call louder than the thunder. The old man lifted the lantern and stepped closer, the flame glowing faintly against the slick stone walls. "If you choose to enter, there is no turning back," he said, his voice steady, as though he had spoken these words many times before. Briggs let out a bark of laughter and shoved past Daniel. "No turning back suits me just fine," he snarled. He stomped onto the first step, his heavy boots echoing hollow against the stone. Carter flinched at the sound, his hands shaking at his sides, his eyes locked on the black stairwell as though it might swallow them whole. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before following Briggs, his heart pounding with every step. Carter groaned softly, but then he too moved forward, whispering as if to himself, "If I stay here I die, if I follow, maybe I live." The old man came last, lowering the lantern carefully as they descended. The flame cast long shadows on the walls, symbols carved into the stone glowing faintly in its light. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of earth, and something older, something that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. Down and down they went, the stair spiraling deeper into the ground until the sound of the storm was gone, swallowed by silence. Briggs growled under his breath, "This is madness. No road, no path out, just holes in the earth." Daniel answered quietly, "Then why are you still walking?" Briggs did not reply. The stairway opened at last into a wide chamber, the ceiling arched high and cracked with roots. Pools of water glistened where rain had leaked through long ago. At the far end stood a wall of stone engraved with markings, circles, lines, and faces twisted into shapes that seemed to shift when the lantern light moved across them. Carter stumbled back, nearly dropping to his knees, his voice cracking. I cannot stay here."
He clutched at Daniel's arm, his fingers cold as ice. "This place is wrong. It breathes. It watches us." Briggs shoved Carter off him, his voice low and angry. "You will shut your mouth before you bring trouble on us." His eyes, though fierce, kept darting to the carvings, as if they unsettled even him. Daniel stepped closer to the wall, his hand rising without thought, drawed again to the markings. His fingertips brushed the stone, and for a moment the chamber seemed to tremble, a deep vibration rising through the ground into their bones. The lantern flickered, shadows danced, and Carter screamed, stumbling back as though the dark had reached for him. The old man raised the lantern high, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The path you chose is no longer yours to leave." His words were calm but heavy, each syllable falling like stone. "You have entered the heart of this place, and it will not let you go without a price." Briggs spat his defiance, his fists clenched. "Then let it take you, old man. I owe nothing to stones and shadows." But even as he spoke, the chamber groaned again, the carvings along the wall glowing faintly as if waking from a long slumber. Daniel pulled his hand back, his chest tight with fear, and yet his eyes would not leave the symbols. They pulsed softly in the lantern light, as though alive. And deep in the silence of the ruins, Daniel thought he heard something move. Not footsteps, not breath. Something else. Something older. The chamber grew colder, as though every flame and every breath was being pulled into the stone itself. The lantern light shook, and shadows crawled along the walls, no longer following the rules of the flame. Carter backed away until his shoulder struck the damp rock, his voice breaking in a hoarse whisper. "We should never have come down here, Daniel. We should never have left. The storm above was safer than this." His words echoed strangely, as though the chamber itself repeated them back in a low, mocking tone. Briggs stood firm, fists clenched, jaw tight, though sweat ran down his face despite the cold. He barked out a laugh, sharp and unsteady. "I am not afraid of old stones and stories," he shouted, as though louder words could drown the weight pressing in on them. The old man lowered the lantern slowly, his eyes fixed on Daniel, as though Briggs and Carter no longer mattered. "The choice has always been yours," he said. "The one who touches the wall is bound. The one who listens will decide if the rest leave or remain." Daniel stared at him, heart pounding so hard it shook his chest. "I never asked for this," he whispered. But even as he spoke, his hand trembled toward the carvings, drawn by a force he could not name. The wall shivered at his touch, glowing brighter, symbols pulsing like veins filled with fire. The chamber roared alive with sound, a deep groan rising from the earth itself, shaking dust loose from the ceiling. Carter screamed, stumbling to the floor, clutching his head, his voice raw. "Make it stop! Make it stop!" Briggs staggered back, his defiance cracking as the ground split in a jagged line beneath him. The old man did not move, his lantern steady, his gaze never leaving Daniel. "The forest took men before it took chains," he said, "and now it calls again." His voice blended with the roar, as if he were speaking not to Daniel, but through him. Daniel felt the carvings pulse against his palm, not stone, but flesh, alive with power, ancient and terrible. Images tore through his mind, chains snapping, storms raging, faces of men lost in the dark, swallowed whole by the earth. He pulled his hand back, but the glow did not fade. It spread across the wall, flooding the chamber in a burning light.
Briggs shouted, his rage turning to fear. "If this is your doing, Hale, then you have doomed us all." He rushed forward, ready to strike, but the ground buckled beneath him, throwing him to his knees. Carter crawled to Daniel, his eyes wide, tears streaking down his dirt-soaked face. "Beg it to stop, Daniel. Beg it to let us go." His voice cracked like a child lost in nightmare. Daniel staggered back, his body shaking from the vision that tore through him. He turned to the old man, his voice raw. "What is this? What do you want from me?" The old man stepped closer. His lantern nearly burned out, yet his eyes glowed with the same fire as the wall. "Not what I want," he said softly. "What it wants, what it always wanted." His voice grew faint, swallowed by the roar. "It chooses who walks free and who remains." The light surged, the chamber splitting with a deafening crack, the ruins shuddering as though the earth itself would collapse. Daniel's knees buckled, his vision blurring, the faces of Briggs and Carter twisting in the glow, shadows stretching around them like grasping hands. And in that blinding moment, Daniel knew freedom was not about fences or guards or broken chains. It was about survival against something far older and far more merciless than any prison built by men.